Hello everyone, today we talk about the Decretum Gratiani, also known as Concordia Discordantium Canonum, the most important canonistic work in the Middle Ages. We'll not talk much about Gratianus per se. It's a bit of a mysterious figure to an extent. In the 12th century, we introduced the Decretum in our series about medieval law, so we know foundationally what this was about. Essentially, as the title of the work itself explains, putting together like in an harmonious, logical, coherent system all the various decrees of the church from the early councils throughout all the history of the church, and of course corroborated by the scriptures, the fathers of the church, and the papal decretals themselves, importantly enough in this moment of peak, right, in fact, of the papal monarchy in the full affirmation after the Concordat of Worms, so the victory in the investiture controversy, that would remain, in fact, a cornerstone, basically for any broader doctrinal foundation of the Church during the Middle Ages and beyond. Today, we specifically talk about Holy War, how Gratian so regulated and interpreted war in general, and of course one that Christians should have been fighting. We made already multiple videos on these topics. I haven't created a playlist just on that. We mostly have just history of Christianity, history of religions, medieval Christianity. I want to create in particular a playlist dedicated to the theory of war, because of the large content we already have. In fact, not much from the theory. For example, the art of war is something that we could distinguish in this sense, but properly the way war was seen historically by different sources we've seen from, in fact, religious figures, including, in fact, fathers of the church, for example, as well as heretics. All right, we've seen it from, late medieval Christine de Pizan, Philippe de Comines. So all figures that have an important place, of course, in the history of literature, and that weren't even necessarily, in fact, military men themselves, but that had an important impact on politics and the way war was conceived and reflected upon. So it's a vast space, and definitely within the Decretum, an enormous amount of insight is to be found on the topic. Today we will address part of this. Consider I recently made some videos about properly 12th century knightly psychology. We also talked about 12th century Western European infantrymen. So you have there a bit the psychophysical, sort of moral and material dimension of the warfare of the earth. Naturally, we made many videos about 12th century warfare and history. In addition to that, there's an entire playlist dedicated to the 12th century. But looking a bit at the background, at the sense religious but mostly legalistic approach, or simply legal approach to war, right? At some point, it's obvious we will talk more about, Bernard of Clairvaux, in a more mystical, properly holy war direction that draws, in fact, from an even more immediately intense traditional background. But this is the important aspect of the Decretum, is that such source is actually informed, as we basically just discuss at large on Schwerpunkt, by the same traditional view of war, and so that even though this source was used for, very specific purposes, there were at times very technical, very bureaucratic, very doctrinal, very conciliary, etc. And it still deepens its roots in the true, correct notion of holy war, and how, in this case, a Catholic world should direct itself towards it. Consider that there is a lot of warfare going on, from the Crusades to also the clashes against the heretics, etc. So the Decretum that we locate in the 12th century in general is quite fitting to many context of brutal violence that we have seen, that in fact the church herself was disciplining. And there is something really incredible, like at least starting from a more conventional 21st century, at this point we know among people pseudo-historical view of what essentially Christianity or the Crusades or whatever actually were, and that actually here instead is beautifully revived in its authenticity. So regarding the theme, the example Gratian uses, because there is all a rhetorical system employed, of course, by the source to make sense of the sources of the church regarding the disciplining of war, to begin, in fact, the exploration of the same in the Causa 23. These are terms now that pertain to the Decretum, how to cite it properly, etc. But in the Causa 23 of the Decretum, the author highlights the deep ties between military actions led by secular rulers and those guided by church officials. Right, made videos about 13th century, for example, warrior bishops. We talked at length about the military retinues that ecclesiastical powers had, and at the backdrop of the investiture controversy, but also the general support, mutual support of the papacy and the empire, we have, of course, known how it was actually even a duty of the bishops to lead their troops, at least to the front, right, where war was being waged, right. Of course, there was all a problem concerning the limits of the clergy to shed blood by themselves. It was a deep theological reason that we will not digress now into the separation of church and state, and that already existed with the foundation of the church itself to begin with, not as most people think in the last couple of centuries of our times, but also a very strongly legal one. It is to say, who did have the right to wage war in say, on behalf of whom, mostly, like where did the imperium proceed from, right? And Gratian tells us that when some bishops and their regions fell into heresy and attempt to spread it to surrounding areas, which is exactly what was happening at this time, by the way, the Pope would instruct. He has, the faculty of instructing bishops who have been granted authority by the emperor to move against these heretics, right? This clause, the fact that bishops had been granted authority by the emperor, is a theme we greatly discussed. It was essentially the one over which the investiture controversy was fought, in that, in fact, did not bring to an exclusive appointment either by the Pope or the Emperor, but both, right? And the entire issue had been which one should have come first, who should have basically had the right prelation. And this was split in the empire, within the empire, within also the papal states, with the precedence of the bishop or the of the emperor or the pope, depending on the areas. But the underpinning reason, logic of this is that the bishops received a secular investiture, right? They were called properly the secular clergy. This is also another topic we can't simply digress on, because it was never fully settled, even by the investiture controversy that, as you know, had also some broader continuation regardless of 1122. And that, however, entailed that, and as we've seen especially in the video about the feudalization of the episcopal investitures, especially in Germany, the almost equation, basically, of bishops as feudal subjects relatively to those beneficia that had, in fact, that belonged to the state, essentially, to the king, to the imperial authority, also in a theological sense, at the root of it. So the one that would get straight from God the right to wage war, to bear arms, the permission to at least arrange this type of war. Naturally, bishops could not simply wage war from a mere position of command. At least they could do it, but there would always be a parallel lay authority that comforted this move or that simply executed it. For example, bishops could not put people to death, right? At the ultimate, even when heretics would burn at the stake, etc., this was always carried out by the local lay authority that was to be, since ever, existing in parallel with the episcopal one. Because originally this in the Christian Empire had been one in the Roman leaders. Now it was split, but obviously necessarily overlapping by traditional notion and law, really, because the Decretum nails this in particular. As a result, the faithful bishops acting under papal orders and their connection to imperial power engage in combat with the heretics. The reason why the Pope commends this is practically the same. The Pope is the spiritual guidance in the picture, so to say, in the world, and the Emperor is meant to follow his advice. So basically, the Pope notices, in this case, we're talking heretics, right, that there is something going wrong with those communities that will at some point resist lawful and orthodox authority. So the papacy will tell the emperor, look, those guys have to go. They have to be reduced to obedience, and if they do not accept this, the good way, we have to wage war on them. So the Pope directs this imperial power. Just yesterday we were talking about how the Romans saw this initial attempt, of course, of pacification. We often, to properly morally justify the eventual necessity to go at war when it would become just wall against wall, right? This was followed also, in fact, in medieval empire. Besides, we have always this notion, just for record, that the papacy, was starting, because this is the normal narrative that you have been fed, that at some point popes began to launch crusades, they got into warfare. Before it was different. This was always the same since the beginning of Christianity, and it was a very good thing, as a matter of fact. We made lots of videos to show how Christianity never opposed support to the Roman emperors. They never were, including the Christians in the Roman army, ever against bloodshed, right? This constituted a sin that was immediately and always recognized, was true also before. We've seen it yesterday in the video about Caesar's Commentario del Bello Gallico, and most people really have literally no clue of this. This is heavily disturbing. You do not immediately kill people. You do not go there without having tried to solve the matter with good manners, so to say. This is, by the way, the direction of military interest, not necessarily the fact that it would just go to raise everything to the ground, but also in terms of deterrence, etc. And the two universal powers had to maintain a double-threaded and parallel connection in terms of political, in fact, and military action. So one side, you could say, a temporal, spiritual and a temporal. Much more to say about this, but again, this had always been the modus operandi, and the papacy had always, like if you look again beyond anti-papistic superstition and delirium and historical unfactuality, the papacy always worked to prevent wars among Christians. I mean, they had also to benefit themselves from it as mediators from their position, but say if two major Christian countries in Europe went at war, or even smaller powers did so within the system, the papacy oversaw that, right, would immediately intervene. This was always the case. Like, if we taught the actual history, the eventual history of all this in schools, instead of sort of presenting the church as some sort of obscure force of evil for some inexplicable reasons, if we didn't know that there is actually a purpose behind this this intention, we would see how warfare was always seen as a big deal, whether against Christians, like if it was happening, or and heretics in this sense, or even those who weren't Christians, who were infidel. And there's also here a blurred line depending on what we're discussing, heretical wise, for example. It's not so much important as to the regulation here that Gratian makes of these circumstances and their handling. Gratian does not limit his analysis of war to purely religious campaigns, like the Crusades, or at least as some people would describe them. Crusades were just the same old way of making war in the name of God, except now they were indicted by the papacy that had a veritable, in this sense, purely and ideally so, spiritual dimension on them. Otherwise, every war is religious. It doesn't make any sense to distinguish the wars of religion from all the wars that were always in the name of God in this era, and for basically almost up to the point which also yet another, maybe atheistic religion would substitute them much later on. Right. Gratian instead focuses on a situation where the interests of the church and the state overlap. Right. He's telling essentially how the two universal authorities and their subjects down the line have to behave. Gratian's findings therefore apply to wars sparked by ecclesiastical commands as well as those driven by secular forces, offering an all-round example what to do in which situation. And Gratian's conclusions are rooted in principle, though he does not aim to construct a detailed theory of just war either. Right? Gratian's work is fundamentally a canonistic work. All right, he basically sets the grounds of what must be done and why, of course, based on some theological ground, but one that he's not sort of philosophically interested in developing further in such regulatory work, right? Because, by the way, that injunction is already inherent those sources. So Gratian, was just relating those and essentially explaining what had to be done just on the basis of the scriptures of Christian tradition. Gratian considers war from two angles, right? The personal ethos of the fighter, probing whether warfare is inherently wrong, and its broader legitimacy, defining what makes a war just, right? These are complementary in nature, because it's evident that whoever is waging an unjust war must be stopped at that point through a just one, all right? And or at least by a mean that is just. These perspectives are tied together by, in fact, the question of whether it is virtuous to protect others from wrongdoing, right? This is how historically even bloodshed, right? So the sin, a mortal sin, by the way, that excluded you from communion, it was a big deal. It was followed. We know it from the penitentials of the era that in what you would stereotypically think to be a lawless, quasi-anarchic, and or at least extremely violent, disorderly society, the church and the laymen were constantly checking on one another and having these rules, these laws, as a matter of fact, respected. So the notion is that in order to prevent a greater sin, you can't sin, right? And this is green-lighted by the church as long as you will eventually atone for that, hopefully in some way. And so that you could have actually augmented the good in the world, and without in fact sitting there simply doing nothing, let instead something wrong happen just because you couldn't, hypocritically, puritanically do anything. By the way, heretics were hypocritically exactly doing that, right? Denying the sense, the importance of the works, making moral relativism, and pretending that the church didn't have to have her own divisions, because the notion is always the same. If you think that Catholicism is about doing whatever you want, meaning literally universal, meaning everybody's church, I think you are looking in the diametrically wrong direction that is set not just by natural order, right? So by divine law, as a matter of fact, in the same Decretum. That is also, in fact, one of the sources for the same canons that require discipline, reason, standards, right? All something that obviously heretics would try to challenge, because in every time, in every society, it's always the same old story, right? There are people who want to build, right, to make things work, and there are the lesser, the inferior, that always want to tear down because they're fundamentally incapable of accepting that there is somebody better than them and that there is an actual truth you can grow closer if you actually have standards and you put yourself at work. Now, the justification for war in the Decretum hinges on the intentions behind the same war, right? The guilt of those who fight or start wars does not arise from the act of warring itself, but from their underlying motives. This is also kind of obvious, right? You can argue that, of course, it's also that the motives are one with the means, meaning that you can have even good motives but doing bad things, and say having bad intentions and said following some rules, at least apparently eventually anyhow to break them, so that at least the latter is unavoidable. But there is in fact always a standard to uphold. Thus, a person could sin by joining a war that is fundamentally just, even if driven by a desire for loot or convinced to commit cruel acts, which was incredibly frequent. Think about the Brabançon, think about all the robbers that followed armies at this point, like they were just in for raiding for all kind of crimes, not just the loot per se, because in a war zone, naturally, authority say collapses far and wide, and as such, it's easier for these figures, especially if gravitating around an army that they feel sort of protected by and they can't come back to, where they find also merchants that are going to buy the loot and giving them money in that case, are always to be around. This naturally is the obvious picture down the line. The Decretum was concerned with specific, like properly with those who were in charge of these systems at large, so mostly the nobility, right? Think about errant knights, also just figures of some power that committed robberies, that abused of their power. So these were really the most important issues that brought, in fact, the superiors in the hierarchical ladder to take measure, also spurred, in fact, by the same church. On the flip side, someone might take part in an unjust war without fault if they're unaware of its lack of legitimacy. By the way, there may be, in fact, hidden reasons, something at least that, by human fault was basically crammed on them, even though it would always be their fault, they would always have, in fact, to amend for it. There is a great emphasis placed on the responsibility of authority, And that's why also the Decretum is here, right? In every case, there could be a link between a person's mindset and the overall rightness of the war. Actually, this is recognized by Gratian, because of course nobody commits any wrongdoing without actually being directly responsible for it at the same time, right? It's never said. This is deeply understood by medieval sources. Moral relativism pertained in traditional society only to the heretics. That's why, by the way, the heretics were always killed throughout all of history. The Romans killed them. The Indo-European world had always put to death these elements. So it's not just a Christian thing for that matter. It's really inherent to the cosmic order, right? What kind of element is objectively so less to be eliminated with even a potential capacity for, as we've seen, doing actually more good with their disappearance, given what they're actually doing at the same time. And you understand how well this ties with war, because these are never innocent people. The more grandiose this is, and the more a fully fledged war this actually reflects, with forces from both sides. At the same time, it's also true doctrinally that, in this sense, the greater the power, the greater the reason, right? So it's actually a Solomonic issue at times to determine what's right, what's wrong, and it's never like there is just full evil from one side and full righteousness from the other. So there are some standards, again, that must always be maintained, at least having God as a point of reference. Canon scholars raised, by the way, all these various possibilities, not just for scholarly entertainment at all. This was truly meant to be applied in reality and constantly. By the way, we've seen it again in the video about the Decretum in general, from which a juridical, political, cultural, civilizational standpoint the Decretum was emerging, right? It was stemming out just of an investiture controversy in the single most advanced parts of Europe, the ones that had the greatest state building, who made more war, right, and that cared much more about these matters, who were more organized, more regulated. The Crusades, by the way, fit this model perfectly as well. This is also, as we were saying, the same age, the same era. Most people agreed that the motives for the Crusades, and thus to the wars themselves, because as we've seen, they were literally the same, were largely righteous. Yet this did not mean every crusader was blameless. This is also very important to understand. If you study the historiography available on, for example, the First Crusade, the most glorious, the sack of Jerusalem was actually considered lawful under the, in fact, laws of war that were abided by basically every people involved, because it's just like during the Albigensian Crusade, God will recognize this own. People often misquote this, or at least they explain this in a wrong fashion by saying, "Oh, look, they were just killing everybody because they didn't care. They were just evil people." No, this was referring to people who had collectively resisted during an actual siege in war to legitimate authority. So whichever their background, they had participated to it. This exists from antiquity. Everybody said, okay, before the siege starts, send out the people who want to leave, right? And the notion is that if a community, if a settlement is resisting to begin with, it's because it has internal support. You cannot maintain, especially a city, a place where there are lots of inhabitants, and pretending that the entire system that supplies the defenses is severed from the inhabitants. The inhabitants are always actively supporting the defense. Otherwise, they would open the gates, which also happened very often. So these people were actually to be put to death, normally. There could be mercy or whatever. The problem was another, though, that in the case in which this people were killed in general, still this was a sin, right? As we explained, because there is infinite potential in human life, and therefore just by killing, you are committing a sin, which is true also for actually not just for human life, because in theory, again, everything belongs to creation. You should be able to handle it without destroying it. So this is a more abstractly philosophical, but still very poignant doctrinal and theological aspect. The Decretum is looking at more conventional secular issues involving both lay and ecclesiastical authorities. And at large, the failures of the Crusades offered, as they happened, as the failures of, say, in that sense, what was expected to be the better side just because it was Christian. So any battle in which they lost, for example, offering strong proof that many joined for selfish reasons, by the way, and other dark motives. We will soon look at the Battle of Antioch, and there is a vast amount of criticism, for example, towards certain leaders here and there, just in the narrative of these works written by clergymen, by the way, many of which we are also witnessing to these events in the Holy Lands, and that realistically mirror what happens in every army. That is to say, somebody is making mistakes, right? There is a problem in decision-making, in the individual performance of the units and their commanders, their troops. Nothing is ever perfect. Legal thinkers looked back to the example of Julian Emperor, Julian the Apostate, in a Christian perspective, when wondering if one could fight under a flawed ruler without sinning, right? And that's also interesting because Julian's personal failings did not automatically taint his orders, right? Even this Christianly renegade leader could rightly expect loyalty from his troops if his call to battle served a valid purpose. There were many Christians. In fact, history says that it's possible that Julian was killed by... I made a video about Julian's campaign against the Sasanians. We also talked about the battle of Vercingetorixum. It's possible that he was actually killed by a Christian in his own army, by the way. That's a legion we will never really know, but just for saying that there were Christian soldiers at the time serving, and that these medieval sources, of course, knew it pretty well, and that there was a general, in fact, as valid purpose, like the defense of the empire, and just its expansion for preemptive purposes, and just the ultimate evangelical mission of Catholic rule that Christians were trying and would achieve through the same Roman Empire as it became Christian itself, for which these soldiers had to fight, even under an evil ruler, so to say, that had repudiated Christianity institutionally, but that in this sense was still doing things right in other ways. This brought the ruler's right to lead and the soldier's duty to follow into focus. There is yet the other very important doctrinal issue that is connected with, in fact, the doctrine of the two natures, as we articulated many times, even made a video, an entire video on the topic, for which, as we were just saying yesterday, render unto Caesar what is of Caesar and give to God what is of God, does not mean do not consider Caesar, right? It is an ideal capacity to basically be one with God, but making it pretty clear that there is an earthly dimension that you have to be mindful of, right? Otherwise, just think about God, about nothing else. No, right? You have to restitute essentially what is not deriving from God, which does not mean in the sense that the way to reach God cannot pass through Caesar himself, right? And so earthly institutions, if that in fact were always strongly backed in the same Christian tradition, together with the empire as well, right? This is again incredibly important. In fact, both, let's say, the ruler and the soldier were tied to the structure and society of the state, which was growing more separate, by the way, from the ruler's individual entity. Doctrine of the Two Natures, there is an office that is just divine, which is in particular the church, that literally does not belong to the earth as well. But you're going to have humans, that is sinners, making up the church. So you're not, as most people that are of course just gnostic heretics today think, so if the church does something bad, the problem is the church itself. So let's tear it down. This is just what lesser people, again, the foretestators that must absolutely embrace any kind of nationalistic and or socialistic ideas just to make up for what everybody sees, that is to say, how much they're departing from God and the full mainstay of an imperial Catholic traditional society. But the meaning is different. It is to say, if the official sins, it's just the officials, not the office. All right, and so the office is sacred. The entire purpose of society is to reach God through this hierarchy, this ultimate power that is, say, intangible in a material sense, but that is of course driven by a power that lays above and that we're inherently tied to. Talk of war helped shape an abstract idea of state itself. You needed more collective discipline, greater concentrated power, an authoritative hierarchy, increasingly supporting the king's right to lead. And as we've seen, even the ecclesiastical system in parallel to it, though debates in 12th century canon law between dualistic and hierarchical views often cloud this shift, right? Because the sense, as we were just saying, is that this corporative view of a non-dualistic sense that spirit and matter are one with one another and you cannot separate them. In fact, they're not separated at all. It's just an illusion to consider them in this way. Would bring some heretics that were dualistic, gnostic, Manichaeans, etc., to deny any earthly power because they identify the latter just into some kind of, material objection and, wealth and something that, according to them, would have not been moved by any merit, by any validity of the works, by any actual virtue. So denying what the Indo-European and just universal millenary tradition had always and exclusively been about, and guess why? And also guess who won, actually, in the end. And Gratian's twofold approach, treating war as both a personal moral challenge and a political matter with its own validity, set the stage, of course, for the best interpretation. And it is something that you should see, essentially, politics and war still today. Also, the Clausewitzian theory goes very well along with it, because there isn't such thing like an abstract state or an abstract war. It always gets down to people. Gratian ties the question of whether serving in war is sinful so closely to the soldier's inner thoughts that he skips over the 10 Commandments ban on killing, which is notoriously, in fact, referring to murdering. And this is what many scholars, in fact, do not really get. The problem was not killing, right? The problem was killing in an essential sense, but the accurate translation is murdering. That is to say, killing for a wrong reason, at least for as we've seen, for an outcome that was not augmenting life in this world, such as killing someone for letting more people or better people to live. Gratian is fully aware of that. That's why he prefers to interpret the goals of a just war, stopping and punishing unfairness, through gospel lessons, right? And not a simply legalistic, deterministic, simplistic, in fact, dualistic, literalistic and fundamentalistic interpretation of the Bible, which is heretical in nature. In fact, it would be a grave mistake to believe that the Gospels imply that injustice should be tolerated and vengeance left to God. You always have a chance to deliver much greater power from God himself, in this sense helping through works in preventing injustice to be to even be tolerated in the world, meaning that yes, every sin is finally punished, but in the sense that whoever commits it is diminishing her own life to the general detriment of the system. But life itself has actually a redeeming potential, a transfiguring one, right, through God's grace, and the imperium itself. That's why there's no doubt about this. It's not an ambiguity. Like, many scholars that study the Decretum itself are completely unaware of this because of essentially a lack of religious historical background. But Gratian's logic is crystal, right? He cares about the community, but also zeroes in how individuals react to violence, because at the end of the day, the overall sum of this, or even something greater, will affect the community per se, right? I'm not going to digress on how, as I said before, everything is everybody's fault at all times, right? This is the true Catholic doctrine at the end of the day. But there is, again, always a chance for redemption and for fixing what may seem unfixable. That is to say, you will never be able to erase the sin that has always happened, that is etched in the universal tapestry, but you can do something that makes up for it, that, as we've said before, allows, even through a sin, for utter redemption to occur, and so to, in broader maths, surpassing that loss. At the same time, Gratian claims God could respond to force with force, since he could have sent angelic armies to save Christ. But this is not the point why Christ came to earth, right? Legitimate violence, in fact, is not wrong. It always comes, as a matter of fact, from God, right? Every power comes from God. The outcome, right, the way it's delivered, the way you always have a chance to do better, is just inherent, as we've seen, the means and the performance. So you could even be well motivated by being, for example, incapable and weak and lose, for example. That is actually, like, not splitting hairs, but reasoning a bit in agnostic term, meaning there's not really a realm in which a war, for example, is wrong or right, separated from the general maths, just for you repeating this term, of global morals, so to say. It's always intertwined to that. So many other factors can intervene. Again, we were talking about this just yesterday in Clausewitzian terms when analyzing Caesar's strategy, as a matter of fact. Consider that Caesar was being read and appreciated in the same ways here. So Gratian's collected points argue that people should use force within the boundaries of God's design. That is to say, using their power for good, right? Not in the sense on terms that are merely earthly in nature. That's what it means, as I was saying before, to have a Catholic perspective of the fact that, for example, there is no such thing like geopolitics. Geopolitics is an inherently anti-Catholic and heretical, and in fact, Manichaean heresy, right? In every action, ultimately, even if we are fallen to the point that we cannot fully understand, of course, God's design, but it's still falling within that, right? And so, for us to make the difference through works, we must be aware of the bigger picture as possible, also the nature of God's grace, right? Consider that even most political commentators and historical religious commentators still make this mistake. For example, Jordan Peterson does not understand the concept of power. Christianly speaking, he Manichaeanly still separates the notion of power in an earthly sense from doing the right thing, as if that did not entail an actual power as grace and imperium. I would like to have a talk with him at some point. It would be really interesting, because that's actually a very puritanic and, in fact, Protestantly influenced heresy, right? Properly stemming from the denial of works' relevance to begin with, but not all, and the deeper meaning that lays under that. In any case, placing the individual under God's authority allows the Decretum to resolve the seeming clash between war service and gospel teachings that, in fact, does not exist. As Gratian saw this submission in a person's intentions rather than their deeds. You always sin with thought, not much with action, right? Because actions are just the reflection of those thoughts. And you always just have a chance to make things happen, even in true thought, right? So we all sin constantly because we are imperfect. So every thought, even what would earthly seem the most conventionally positively inspired, is faulty, is inherently, it has an element of evil in it, which doesn't mean it doesn't have an element of good that can surpass that, right? So, but still, it's imperfect. So the enactment is always going to be, there is always a margin for fixing that, and that's how we are connected with God and why works do work. But the outcome as humans is always going to be imperfect to a degree. Now, gospel rules that appear to reject war service are in fact also not quite that, and they relate, if anything, to the preparation of the heart, the preparatio cordis, that is in fact also dealt with by Gratian in chapter 23, question 1, dictum post causa 7. The issue there is deeply important because Bernard of Clairvaux in these very years was recurring to the preparation of the heart as that mystic ascetical practice that was used always in the ancient war bands and the initiatic testing. But in fact, at this point also, for example, by the monastic military orders, in a monastic sense, to in fact provide with a complete model of a divine pursuit through holy war, right? This existed also in Islam as well. Think about the Murabitun themselves. It was a broader universal principle, and so the preparation of the heart, even evangelically speaking, does not eliminate the eventual action in the world, right? Also, the monastery is intended as a bit the model of the urbs historically, to be imitated, to be replicated. And so was this kind of holy war lifestyle, because and the entire Catholic tradition revolves around holy war. It's actually the only mean for salvation. You can understand it in a psychomagic way, right? So that you understand martyrdom as literally a form of witness of, in fact, the divine, after you have that emerges from within your same force to have, by transmuting the darkest furies of your sinful nature into the heavenly maiden that will lead you to heaven. It is nothing but your own transfigured soul that will make you earn that place in the firmament. So the preparation is necessary for action. And the two things technically go in parallel, but this preparation is basically the contemplative element of it. And now, wrong actions by individuals turn war service into sin, obviously, like fighting out of hate or greed for rewards. If you look at the principles of chivalry in the same years, they refer to that. In fact, it was a higher principle that did not really seem retributive, but that really was because the retribution comes in the higher nature, the perennial one, not in this earth. Which does not mean that two natures are actually separated, and that on this earth the power obtained by a victorious knight, say, is not going to be meaningful. We could tie this further to providence, to how knights literally believed this, and mostly today we have the sense of providence tied to avenues that are so unintelligible that things happen, even, of course, bad things happen to good people, but they never really happen. I mean, if you're a person, you're not even just ever good, right? So the reason why things happen are often hidden to us because we are limited in understanding, but it's not like this retribution, this direct application of grace or lack thereof does not actually take place constantly and directly and immediately. War service aimed not at personal gain, but at the good of the wider community earns the greatest praise, but also the greatest power, as a matter of fact, which also, in fact, sets the ground for justifying earthly power, which is something, for example, that Christendom does abundantly, as opposed to Islam, that is always distrustful towards the same. And I think that the outcome is pretty self-evident. Now, for such wars, Gratian crafted his view of the just one, pulling from different authors, such as Isidore of Seville, the great Iberian scholar and ecclesiastic of 6th century Spain, and the same St. Augustine of Hippo, father of the church. Isidore of Seville was really the author of the most widely used encyclopedia in the Middle Ages, whereas St. Augustine was basically the single most influential father of the church and, generally speaking, vessel of Neoplatonic approach until, in fact, this very century, right? If you look at Bernard of Clairvaux, we are still within that ascetic, mostly also border limit orthodox at some point, considering the importance given to the spirit just as such, before Aristotle held sway in the various universities of Europe, including the theological capital, that is the Sorbonne of Paris. Thus, for Gratian, holy war is fought under orders and punishes wrongdoing. Chapter 23, Question 2, Dictum Post Causa 2. Holy war is redemptional in its effects. Naturally, holy war is not simply a claim to holy war, but the actually righteous war with God's reason from your side, which is largely what essentially before a certain time when historiography was still too simple is the only thing that really you find in medieval literature. Battles are not won by this tactic or another, but depending on whose side God was, right? And this is so deeply foundational because eventually the value of an army is going to reflect the development of its civilization, therefore the might of its righteousness rewarded by God with victory, which immediately happens. This is just by deterrent degree and just the eventual military deeds. Right at the start of the Decretum, Gratian established the right to defend oneself and resist force with force as a basic rule of natural law. All right. This is, again, incredible importance because it founds literally the right to self-defense, to survival, so showing immediately that it's absolutely not true that you should let's say, turn the other cheek in the sense of simply letting yourself getting killed. Basically, turning the other cheek stands for, you don't scathe me, right? If I have God from my side, nothing can stop me anyway, and so it's practically irrelevant whatever you actually do. And it is really irrelevant. It's not just like faking it. And obviously, of course, this parable refers to the doctrine of the two natures, right? People who still read the Gospels ignoring the doctrine of the two natures will always fall in the same mistake of thinking that you have to literally turn the other cheek. That's not what it means in divine terms. Now, this held true altogether, by the way, for individuals and societies alike. So, of course, if the society was threatened, they had the right to strike back. Thus, a just war should defend and uphold the law. This meant not only that the church could call for military aid, but also that there was an obligation to use arms to safeguard one's land. We've seen this also in other videos about the righteousness of war, including from heretics. We've seen it from among the Lollards, the Hussites, the Cathars, and beyond. That, of course, what had been established in the Decretum, also echoed in later history, among heretics, like getting one part right and the other degenerating, just showing that I had not studied enough theology and literally not knowing what they were talking about because they had any parallel theory, but because just they didn't have any. In fact, this is also the point of why heresy lost from one side, that there was nothing that could counter the type of just even thought that had been developed within the Catholic tradition, also well before Christianity. Now, in general, someone who did not protect their neighbor from unfairness was as guilty as the one causing it. This is also a beautiful Catholic principle. In fact, we live in a world of radically inferior people, personally, morally, and culturally, that believe that basically if something happens from the other side of the world, it's none of your business because it's not in danger of your piece of dirt, that is just a product of the fall. And one of the first indicators of the deeply rooted inferiority of a people is, in fact, isolationism. It's a completely and diametrically opposite concept to the imperial Catholic tradition, and one, of course, of the necessity of a sole rule being affirmed in the world, together with the divine nature of those who are able to establish that. Of course, if somebody is being unjustly aggressed and you don't intervene, you're just a lesser human being, and you should be treated as such, with all the consequences also of actual war that should be backfiring on you. And it always happens, by the way, historically. Gratian frames this, by the way, as a rule of just, even like it's founded in divine law, in just the general metaphysical reflection of reality. But as such, of course, it's deeply seated in the heart of man as a rule of personal ethics. If you are not strong enough to uphold that, you're, in fact, that's an index of being a lesser being. From this angle, the just war's aim, serving justice, matched the warrior's moral outlook. And that's why, in fact, knights were out there going out conquering, molding in their own image, ruling, affirming their superiority, and just the dirty, stinky peasant stayed at home. Of course, like, he would work for the knight, but the sense is that he would have been a more fearful, cowardly element of it all, simply because they could not afford what all freemen had been once as soldiers, as freemen in arms. And so always look at what also societies are made of in practice, comparatively and diachronically. Gratian's take on whether to punish injustice only strengthens this idea. By the way, usually duty to the community means not letting unfairness go unchecked or spread freely. Thus, the death penalty is allowable as well, right? Even though it's not necessarily the death penalty is probably one of the most liminally contentious topics for reasons that I will not digress on now, but evidently if there is another use you can make of the person, and if you believe, again, that there is still potential in that life, as long as this person is not actively threatening any other's life. In that sense, it's a bit useless. Even just you could simply imprison them. All right, you could say that the food used to maintain this could save other people's life. Granted, you could put these people down. This is just not the focus of this video, but it's what is important, if anything, here is that putting people down is something that is accepted in the earthly order for the same reasons that can compromisingly bring to such settlement in a given contingency, in a given situation. So again, when you read in the Old Testament the ban on murdering, by the way, not killing, and Christ's words that those who live by this word will die by it, which means yet another thing, in fact, have nothing to do with you cannot kill, right? Killing is a faculty that God has given you, by the way. If that hadn't been the case, you wouldn't be here to begin with, right? This faculty is present within God himself. It's contained in the moment in which the imperfection generated by you brings even that killing as a possibility for redemption. The sword phrase also has to do, actually Christ himself says, I came by the sword. So if you quote that, like, those who live by the sword will die by it. Of course, leave, because coming with the sword is another thing, but it's exactly the point. Do not think that, of course, violence is an end to itself. This is what it means, which is also kind of obvious, and many people, unfortunately, do not understand it either, and are also the ones who eventually fail in the exercise of this word. This is also, in fact, what Christ really meant, and it is beautiful, in fact. Gratian, by the way, catches one specific point about these scriptural passages that is, in his view at least, prescriptionally, as far as the Concordia Discordantium canon was concerned, in, again, the world, in the earthly dimension, such passages only forbade killing without permission, considering that this was a highly stratified hierarchical society. So nobody could simply kill just at their wish. This is essentially how our laws are founded. You cannot, right? Who says this? The state says that, which is in turn the people, which in turn have been given power by God, so that actually people can't kill others without permission. But there is a higher principle that brings to the pacification of society through a series of, at least even through a series of discretional decisions, but by the side of higher authorities that are there for a reason, that is God's grace. Undoubtedly, the heretics always see, such as the populists, again, that are Manichaean in nature, that no, these people are terrible, we are the better ones. Yes, except that does not explain why you're at the bottom of the system and actually do not do anything better. Actually, the contrary. So it's always the lack of standards there, and objectivity, of course. A lot of moral relativism pushing this for obvious reasons, which is an attempt in their own ways to do better, but failing and paying for it, which is also funny to look at. Now, a public official can take life if the law demands it. For example, I will skip here the references to the Decretum, but it's plenty of them. Gratian lists numerous canons, in fact, to show that secular power can order and justify killing without leading to guilt or sin, at least as far as that order is concerned. Then, again, it's not like you're without sin that is maintained. You will have committed that, but this is something that you have to tell your priest in confession. It's not something that society should simply, at least outside of the church, should be concerned of. Naturally, the church overlaps here because everybody's a Christian, so everybody is part of the church at least. But and in fact, as we were saying before, community is highly regulated. This aspects in terms of how much have you sinned, how many people have you killed in war. That's important to stress. Now, that prescription in the Decretum covers, by the way, both the death penalty and war at the same time. so that I have to execute an order by putting someone to death by earthly standards, which are the ones that here Gratian is disciplining, not the ones that lay at the root in the perennial dimension, do not render you, in fact, an outlaw, right? Then you will have to deal with the issue privately, but not in this institutional sense. And of course, even war can be seen as a unique type of punishment campaign when, of course, it is a right war. Gratian's perspective on the just war strongly favors secular power, as you understand, which includes the, in fact, the secular one of the church itself. It couldn't be different. It's literally a physical status as opposed to a metaphysical one that are always intertwined anyway. The church has power. The church has land. I made a video months ago explaining exactly this regarding the sort of the metaphysical foundation of papal temporal rule as well. In the 12th century, this naturally placed emphasis on the king as well, but not only. Again, the Decretum was issued by the papacy, so much of this backed the same Patrimonium Sancti Petri and any other ecclesiastical possession around the world. The 12th century is, however, also undoubtedly the moment of the development of feudal states, feudal monarchies, that as Christians are allied to the church, and as we've seen before, being the actual Armstrong of the same papacy. Because when something goes wrong, the papacy has to whistle, and these guys are going to intervene. They're going to go to war in the Outremer, Crusades, fighting the heretics at home, and just bringing order, like the faculty of comminating capital penalty, really required the bishops to get an advocate for carrying that out, because they couldn't do that as clergymen. Because the sin evidently was there, so there was no ambiguity here. You can't. The problem with history sometimes is that you get this info scattered, right, and without premises and without other references and sort of intersection of different sources at a time. But here, there was no ambiguity. Like, society at the time literally worked like this. That's not to say that everybody was Gratian and that the Decretum wasn't thus needed. On the contrary, but the Decretum also didn't spring out of nothing. And it was the natural consequence of, at a canonistic level, of such an enormous civilizational development in the 12th century. Gratian aligns God closely with secular authority, identifying the imperium in it implicitly. In asserting that war could be waged under divine sanction, he uses the expression Deo auctore, so literally, because God makes it happen, right? It's not just a sanction; it's an action, right? It's essentially these authorities operating on behalf of God on earth. Importantly enough, right? So this is nothing to do again with "thou shalt not murder," because murder and killing are two completely different things. Whoever highlights this simply does not know. It's not just a matter of knowing ancient languages and biblical studies. It's simply the deeper theological implication of it in the Catholic tradition, even before Christianity. Now, in this context, Gratian weaves the crusade, a war, as we've seen, fought for God's cause, into a legal framework. Yet, he does not develop his arguments by directly pointing to the crusade. Rather, he draws on examples like the wars against Israel, when it turned away from God, and the Roman destruction of Jerusalem as a retribution for Christ's crucifixion. This is an incredibly interesting historical interpretation. We just made a couple of weeks ago videos about the Roman-Jewish wars. We've seen the level of destruction that the Jews went under on those occasions. And Gratian interprets this as, well, up to Christ, that was a Jew himself. The Jews themselves had been, at least within the Judeo-Christian tradition, the depositories of the most, through the Old Testament, etc., of the most righteous, right, divine mandate and sanction and authority. However, the fact that Rome here is a still pre-Christian Rome is the vehicle of God's destruction of the Jews who had turned their back to Christ is astonishing, because not just it aligns with what we have seen and we were hinting at before, that is to say that all Christians supported not just the Roman Empire, but the Roman army. They just wanted it to become Christian and not to, in fact, sacrifice to an authority they did not deem but earthly, not to treat the emperor as God, that is, and also because of the inherent limits, especially after Augustus, of such authority. And again, even though the Roman Empire was the greatest authority that ever existed in that regard, but exactly for that, and the requirement of a higher, stronger moral standard, that spiritual standard, in fact, Christ highlights throughout all the point. But it's not just a random coincidence, of course, that Christ was born under Augustus at all. Could have not been otherwise. There is properly a passage of power there. But that Rome, that is not some random pre-Christian and non-Christian power here, was the vehicle of a righteous war, evidently. Right? So, because if Gratian identifies the destruction of Jerusalem that the Romans carried out as, in fact, God's will, right, through his wrath, for having brought to even Christ's crucifixion. So it wasn't even just that there is a collective guilt there of the Jews intended. Let's stress the fact that in the Middle Ages, of course, even though Christians protected the Jewish community because they had to be preserved, and especially the higher authorities, because it had to preserve until end time. This has nothing to do with the modern concept of tolerance, right? Still, pretty bad things were done, like to repress this group, to depict them in this sense, in a way that would make sense in terms of this enormous sin. And so that Rome was, so as the empire, this is the most important thing for the Decretum, and so the empire intended also in a metaphysical sense, so not just saying, I don't know, at the time of the investiture controversy, obviously, again, the guy in office as emperor that was excommunicated as Antichrist by the Pope, right? We're talking about properly the imperium meant as the Holy Ghost, divine grace, Nike, Victoria, all right, was vehiculated by Rome, that had thus not to be some random providential mean of God, but the ultimate mean of God, the Catholic empire, the ecumenic empire that, especially after Christ, had become the main point of reference also for the church, right? Now, on earth, these instances form the cornerstone of Gratian's reasoning that are extremely powerful. It would be incredibly interesting to deepen, to research. I'm not sure this has ever been done. Gratian's references to Romanity, to properly the Roman Empire in a historical sense. This is one of the most famous passages indeed. By the way, since God alone truly directs battles, remember in the Old Testament, God is the Lord of battles, that literally descends into the fray together with the Israelites against their enemies, the king has no place in this logic, especially given that kings were not foundational or central to the crusading effort, right? This is important too because Gratian is an ecclesiastical source, being wary that there is no real central power at the time. And this in contrast, highlights even more importantly the role of the Roman Empire that we made in the previous example from the Decretum, as if to say that, in fact, there must be such overarching authority on earth as well, ideally, and that yet this is always subordinated not just to God, but to His grace, and so the reception of the imperium through virtue and deeds. Gratian focuses more on proving that war and killing could be legitimate even without a secular figure like the king. Because ultimately, yes, the sense of dissent wasn't truly understood. We've seen it even in those videos in which not just we've seen what the heretics were saying against constituted order, not just the church or any broader theological issues that, as we've seen, were pretty poor, obviously, from the heretics. But in particular, in the responses to the heretics that did not deny, even as earthly authorities that were aiming first to achieve pretty big level of power. We've seen the Kingdom of England itself against the Lollards, for example. They were literally saying, I don't know, if the king went crazy or if the state began to do something wrong, people have right to rise up, right? They were saying it themselves. This is how self-aware and civilized medieval were in their institutions. But recognize, of course, that the same institutions were necessary for a reason, and only if they came short of their own duty, they could be contested. And so they were not telling heretics, we put you to death or we punish you in any way, aside from the theological issues, because you're causing we just have to put you down just because you cause unrest, but because there is a moral reason why the reason, in fact, you're causing unrest is wrong. And this is the fundamental Catholic point. Also because that power could not be wielded by earthly authorities, weren't they right? Understood? Gratian notes that saints were sometimes addressed, quote, by peoples steered by divine command, literally per populus divino iussu excitatus, right? Which is exactly what we just said. That is to say, a people that is motivated by higher cause that surpasses earthly authorities. This is exactly how the Christians opposed themselves to Roman rule, to the extent the Roman rule was imposing something wrong on them, but they were not opposing themselves to the entirety of Roman rule, and actually they won over that authority, those negative officials that were not in fact, receiving enough imperium to win, because they were not divinely ordained, and that's how the empire became Christian. Gratian says also something very interesting, that is to say, how some groups unknowingly became God's tools, right? There is this sense of providence whereby you may actually not believe yourself how much power you have within you. And this is beautiful from a source that is actually there to set order and lawfulness and a general sense of trust towards authority, that it goes as far as saying, well, there are people who are really called by God to perform great things, even against any other authority. So this is how deep, conscientious, and in this sense righteous medieval authority really was. This was, again, official source of the church, right? It was adopted at least fully as such and informing the entire ecclesiastical law and heavily influencing, as we've seen in the video about the Decretum, lay law, right? Because they were mutually influencing each other at the same time. The jurists of this stuff came from the same environments, basically. And the wars of those that are thus unknowingly God's tools might not lack justification, but their leaders could still carry personal blame equally. They always do, actually, unless they are God himself. In contrast, going back to the previous historical example, Israel intentionally fought its conquest wars under God's direction, making the territories it took its rightful, divinely granted property. And this is basically the entire Old Testament. Charlemagne was obsessed with David. We know that such such scriptures were incredibly foundational in Latin Germanic sense of statehood in the High Middle Ages and beyond. Deliberate obedience to God legitimized Israel's campaigns and turned its conquests into land bestowed by divine will. This is incredibly, incredibly important. So it was for every righteous person. In the final statement of Gratian's discussion on the death penalty, he refers to wars ordered by God to punish sins, particularly defiance of the divine order. The ideology of the Crusades likewise supported punishing offenses against God. I made an entire video about how the Albigensian Crusade literally started, a bit more ahead, like at the beginning of the 13th century, but still heavily, legally backed by sources like Gratians and further papal decretals that were integrated, as you know, in the Decretum. In fact, again, we made lots of videos about that. I don't remember whether I have to re-upload those because of the pictures, but you have the full audio, the full lessons right on display. Additionally, Gratian's separation of those who obey God knowingly versus unknowingly counters a key objection to the Crusades. Critics often charged that Crusaders sought not to carry out God's will, but to chase their own gains. Gratian thus offers comfort for losses. Those who followed God had to repent for their sins to reclaim success. He places war within a God-driven historical narrative, a view that easily includes the Crusade. As a war under God's authority, the Crusade is a vital element of Gratian's just war doctrine. By the way, the sins issues was the same identical one you could find in the Donatistic issue in some instances, that the heterodox were not heretical, pauperistic, evangelical movements were pointing at. That is to say, if the priest is a sinner, are my sacraments valid? They would say no, because they wanted to tear down the entire hierarchy, and that was, in fact, their ultimate goal as incredible sinners and absolutely not better than the church at all. That was really, as you see here, a powerhouse of civilization, in that, in fact, rightfully stated that, as in every sacrament, it's not about the individual, the official, that the sacrament is valid, but what is truly, he's just a medium, right, of God. And he can't be better or worse. But if he who confesses himself is truly repented, has truly gone through contrition, and he recognizes his fault and is ready to atone for it, well, then an adequate penitence will do, and will be understood just in the heart of the faithful. So even in the worst case scenario, in that sense, the sacrament is not going to be ineffective or just invalid because the priest is unfit, right? This is literally not how it works. There are many liminal cases in Christianity where you technically don't even need a priest. Like, for example, in cases like to impart the last sacrament, if there is not a priest available, any baptized person can do that, right? There is a lot that you can do in extremis, but tradition predates Christianity. In Catholicism, this is pretty explicit in Catholicism, in the narrower version, as we understand of Catholicism as a confession, but that of course means the broader one also in that but that people sometimes nobody for today's Christianism, whichever it is pretty far from its originally Catholic forms, and so also Catholicism got a bit lazier over time. But that's, interestingly enough, something that is still very explicitly maintained, and actually everything is maintained. But it's also popularly heard still that in Catholicism, tradition is predating Christianity itself. Is incredibly important. Though the crusade was, in theory, directly led by God. It was the Pope who actually announced these military ventures as Christ's vicary on earth. The crusade belonged to the church, right? Nobody else had the right to launch a crusade. If anything, this was inherent to the cooperation between temporal and spiritual powers, as they had always existed. It could have really not existed without the other, and of course, one without the other. And of course, in the times of papal monarchy here, the church had already made its statement regarding to whom that faculty pertained. Gratian examines whether the Pope and bishops could take part in martial activities in the last section of his war-related Causa. This is a practical question of church governance as shown by his sources. He leans little on late antiquity theology here. Instead, he relies heavily on papal writings up to Alexander II, especially their decrees about wars against non-Christians in Spain that had been essentially sort of the most precocious ground for crusade development, crusading theory development. We talked about this. If you go in the 11th century series, you will find something like Holy War, the Normans, the Papists, something like that, because it was starting way before the Gregorian reforms, by the way. But it had also kept refining over time. And Spain was sort of more important in this juridical sense because, as we've seen with the Mudeyyars, large minorities of, in fact, Jews and Muslims under Christian dominance, there was a much deeper problem to untangle as opposed to just taking over certain strongholds in the Levant and being obviously not there to simply Europeize, let's say, the Levant in, say, unlike Spain, that at large had always at least been Spain, regardless of the Islamic invasion. And so it was sort of closer and also with important Christian presence under the Muslims. That was true in reverse as well in the Iberian Peninsula. But we have seen, of course, the popes at war. Think about the Battle of Civitate, in which the Pope was also taken prisoner by the Normans. Think about, again, the warrior bishops that literally went at war, without also too many moral qualms for that matter. From this, Gratian grants popes complete military power. They can start a war, lead it, and even join in the fighting, which is really interesting because it's understood as a faculty. It's not understood as a general, okay, they should simply do it, incentivizing it. The popes themselves did not really have much interest in that just per se. They had much greater power to wield, to be, in fact, even way more effective. The Pope is the Pope after all. Bishops, interestingly, and however, have restricted roles in war. They can call people to defend the Christian faith if needed, but they should generally avoid secular matters and military actions, which was not really done. So the Decretum is a bit looser here, a bit less stringent, because immediately if the Pope could, everybody else could. But as we've seen, the bishops didn't literally have to live by this word, right? By the way, this rule applies specifically and explanatorily only to bishops whose funds come purely from church purposes, like tithes and offerings, and who have no obligations to their country's king. Conversely, at least this is the ideal scenario, but we know that, we said it at the beginning, bishops were also vassals, secular vassals of secular authorities. This differed from, in fact, those bishops who had been given lands, castles, and towns by the king and owed him duties in return. By the way, bishops at large had often controlled on behalf, probably of public authority, so generally speaking, of the ultimate secular one on earth, entire cities at a time. These times are slightly different, but there are very powerful bishops indeed that really have provincial seigniories that are very, very powerful in their own regard. In any case, all bishops must follow Christ's teaching. According to the aforementioned, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, which includes loyalty in military matters, literally in rendering, right, that, right, which is not to say, get rid of Caesar. That's not what the passage means, right? You have to render unto Caesar what Caesar might have, what is of Caesar in the sense that he has given to you, and you have to render it, not restitute that or abandon what he's given you. So again, this is of incredible importance. You understand how, of course, Gratian is a great source that perfectly blends all sort of ecclesiastical knowledge with, however, quite concretely secular one, a lay one proper, rendering really an incredibly clear, precise, and right picture of what should be or not be done. Gratian's view of the duties bishops owe kings reflects the solution offered by the Concordat of Worms in 1122 to this issue in the empire. Bishops had been invested in part by the emperors as well. The fact that it would be mainly be chosen by the church, and that this investiture could be preceded. At some point, the emperor could have given it first, etc. Still, obviously, mirrors the necessity of universal powers to back each other at the same time and regulate these issues also of the dioceses from a lay perspective, as much as the church had its saying in lay matters. The type of bishopric decided whether a bishop had to take on tasks outside his religious role. Gratian understood the outcome of this shift. A bishop indebted to the king was much like a worldly lord, and in many areas of Europe this was just the norm, really, also because bishops came normally from the same families of the feudal nobility, and in some cases had literally been initially trained as laymen, as knights, as much as other important lay rulers had at some point been addressed towards an ecclesiastical career. The Summa Elegantius in Jure Divino, also known as Summa Coloniensis, because it came from Cologne, and that is a medieval legal text from the same century, associated with the development of canon law that Gratian's Decretum was part of. In fact, it's comprehensive commentary or treatise that builds on Gratian's Decretum in its foundational collection of church laws. Written in Latin, the Summa is attributed to an unknown author, though some speculate connections to figures like Bertram of Metz or Geoffroy, that is named Colonensis due to its possible origin in colonialism. The work is notable for its elegant and systematic approach to divine law, the jus divinum, right? That is also natural law in canonistics, addressing ecclesiastical rules, theology, and legal principles, right? Edited in modern times by scholars Gerhard Franzen and Stephen Kuttner, it remains a key source for understanding medieval canon law, and in defining a bishop's identity, put it similarly to, in fact, Gratian. It says, in God's matters, they serve as bishops, as far as the bishops are concerned. In earthly matters, as dukes. So we're recognizing that you literally have to render to Caesar what is of Caesar's, including in this lifestyle, right? After all, bishops were secular clergymen by definition, and so their duty to defend their shepherds were understood to be discretional to the degree they also owed a power to a broader system within which the community was. Then, of course, there is a personalization, privatization of power. And again, I explained it mostly in that video about the feudalization of episcopal investitures after Cologne in Germany, Worms in Germany, after the end of the investiture controversy. Still, Gratian gave significant weight to the king's demand for military loyalty, which held firm even against the ideal bishop's life. Yet he also insisted that a bishop needs papal approval before joining his king on the battlefield in person, so that the Concordat of Worms settlement was not discarded. Again, Gratian writes mostly for a papal purpose, and as we've seen at the beginning, it is literally the Pope who orients the empire's military action. Thus, everybody existing under imperial authority in the world, in theory, including the bishops, are disregarded still going to war if they do, because the Pope wants that, and also in the specifics of the individual bishops, if the Pope has anything to say about them. In reality, this rule went unenforced. At least it was difficult to simply commend such a thing on a broader Christian scale. The peak of papal power was yet to come, and even at that point, under Innocent III, when virtually all European kingdoms were vassals of the Pope, it's not like the Pope could simply and literally control every single person, as they could simply tell what bishops at some point had different allegiances. Some were truly loyal to the local reign, to the local king, so to say, than to the Pope. Right? This really depended. We've seen it in investiture controversy. There were some pro-imperial bishops that supported, of course, their own dependency on the emperor rather than on the Pope. And we will come back on these topics. But just to make an example, Sicard of Cremona, a commentator on the Decretum, saw this idea of course, just every bishop to simply obey the Pope as a matter of when he could go at war or not, just as a recommendation. So this intertwines, of course, with the vicissitudes of the time. We have this broader picture, like, for example, Sicard of Cremona is an interesting figure. He was this Italian prelate born around 1155 and died in 1215. So an hell of a hero, because it was from the first descent of Frederick Barbarossa into Italy to the Fourth Lateran Council that I made a video on recently, as the peak of pastoral power of the Catholic Church. And this guy was also a historian, a writer from Cremona. I made a video about medieval Cremona. We talked often about Liutprand, but the history of the city is also very interesting. There are many authors coming from Verona in this area. It was a quite active and central city in Lombardy. Sicard was likely born into the Casalaschi family, and he studied law in Bologna. Unsurprisingly, because again, the Decretum stems from at least this parallel to, in fact, lay studies of law that, from, in fact, that standpoint stemmed from the recovery of Roman law, so backed by the emperor at the same Diet of Roncaglia, when Sicard was 3 years old, to recover, in fact, the essentially Theodosian, Justinian law that conferred much greater power to the emperor, like in the Byzantine tradition. It would not be applied either. But Sicard of Cremona studied in Mainz as well, or in the Rhineland, and so he entered the clergy with minor holy orders in 1179 under Bishop Offredus of Cremona. In 1183 he was ordained a subdeacon of Pope Lucius III and sent as an envoy to the same Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, just for saying, like, when he would be an envoy to the guy who was literally invading Italy when he was, even before he was born. So just think about the generational divide, but still the same context. It's beautiful, really. After Offredus' death in 1185, Sicard was elected Bishop of Cremona himself, a position he held until his death on June the 8th, 1215. And as bishop, Sicard was deeply involved in both ecclesiastical and civic affairs. That's why he had a saying on this stuff. In fact, he defended Cremona's interest, notably laying the foundation for a castle, the Castrum Leonis, that is now Castelleone, in the Cremonese, in 1188 to counter threats from Crema, that is yet another, it's a city northwest, close to Milan. He supported Frederick II, by the way, against Otto IV, right, at the time of the struggle over Sicily and for the empire until Bouvines. And he was so entangled in those affairs that he joined, we are in the time of Innocent III, the Fourth Crusade himself, traveling to Constantinople with a papal legate. Just think about what kind of profiles were debating this. So he was actually Bishop of Cremona. He went over to the Fourth Crusade. So obviously he had something to say about what bishops could or could not do regarding papal imperial authority. This guy had been an ambassador to the emperor. He had been literally in the milieu of the Pope. So his writings include the Chronica Universalis, a history from creation to 1213, valued for its insight into contemporary events like the Crusades, the Summa Canonum, a canon law handbook, so he was into canonistics as well, and the Mitrale, a 9-book work on liturgy, right? And so this is a great figure that just so randomly, like today we talked about other things, but even just picturing, I like biographies because they really show you like what did these people do in their lives. Instead of talking about just theoretical concepts that are not abstract, but without seeing them in practice in these individual people's lives, it's a bit difficult to understand how and why they worked and in all what was happening at the time. So let's never confuse also contents, themes, just from the deeply intertwined reality. Just we have to make clarity for didactic sake from a topic to another, but at large, we're talking about a very, very impactful world, and all the implications really stemming from that in the deep realization of how important a work like the Decretum was for the very reality that the world was at the time. Again, if you've never heard about the Decretum, nor about this why it was important, again, it's a bit difficult to understand medieval history, right? But again, we live in a world in which knowing medieval history is just some weird, I don't know, YouTube video game legacy from the last decade, and it barely has much to do with historical reality. In any case, I'm very glad to be covering these topics. There is definitely a lot still to do in many directions. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.